"Grandma, why don't you have any pictures from before Dad turned 10?" Sophie asked across the dinner table, and for a moment, nobody moved. Melissa's wine glass slipped from her fingers and tipped sideways onto the white tablecloth. Red wine spread slowly like a stain nobody wanted to acknowledge. Ryan cleared his throat too quickly. "Sweetheart, that's not really important," he said, forcing a laugh that sounded thin and nervous. But I wasn't looking at him. I was looking at Melissa. My daughter-in-law had gone pale beneath the soft golden light hanging above the dining room table. Her hand tightened around her napkin so hard I could see her knuckles turning white. I had seen that look before. Not fear exactly. More like panic carefully disguised as irritation. "Actually," I said softly, setting down my fork, "that's a very good question." The room felt suddenly smaller. Too warm. Outside, rain tapped gently against the kitchen windows of Ryan's suburban Connecticut home, and somewhere upstairs, the television hummed faintly in an empty bedroom. Sunday dinners used to feel comforting to me. Familiar. I used to spend all afternoon baking casseroles Ryan loved as a boy and bringing homemade desserts Melissa always pretended to compliment. But lately, every family gathering carried a strange tension underneath it, like everyone else had been handed a script except me. Sophie looked up innocently from her mashed potatoes. "I just noticed Grandpa isn't in any old pictures either," she said. "Not the young ones." Melissa stood up too fast. "I think we should have coffee in the living room," she interrupted sharply. Ryan immediately nodded in agreement without even looking at me. That hurt more than it should have. My son used to defend me without hesitation. When he was 8 years old, he once punched another little boy for making fun of my gray hair at a grocery store. Now he couldn't even meet my eyes across a dinner table. "I'll help your mother with dessert," he muttered, standing so abruptly his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. Melissa shot him a look. A quick one, but I caught it. I had started noticing those looks years ago. Silent conversations, passing between husband and wife, while I sat nearby, smiling politely like a guest in my own family. I folded my napkin carefully onto my lap and glanced toward the hallway wall where framed family photos lined the staircase. Vacation pictures, Christmas mornings, graduation ceremonies, 20 years of memories displayed in matching silver frames. And suddenly, Sophie was right. There were almost no photographs from before Melissa entered our lives. No pictures of Ryan as a little boy at our lake cabin in Vermont. No photos of the beach trips his father loved. No framed snapshots of our old house in Boston where Ryan learned to ride a bicycle in the driveway. My stomach tightened slowly, not with anger, with something colder. Confusion mixed with recognition, like hearing a familiar song played slightly out of tune. "Grandma," Sophie asked quietly, "are you okay?" I smiled at her automatically. "Of course, sweetheart." But I wasn't okay. Because for the first time in years, small forgotten moments began returning to me all at once. Boxes of photographs disappearing after our move in 2007. Melissa insisting old albums had been damaged in the basement flood. Ryan growing strangely defensive anytime I brought up his father. Tiny things. Harmless things. Except now they no longer felt harmless. Melissa returned carrying the coffee tray with both hands perfectly steady again, her expression calm and polished. The panic had vanished from her face so completely that I almost wondered if I had imagined it. Almost. She set my coffee cup down in front of me with a smile that never reached her eyes. "You know how old memories can upset people," she said lightly. "Sometimes it's healthier to let certain things stay in the past." I stared at the steam rising from my coffee. Then I looked up at her. "Funny," I said quietly. "I've started thinking the exact opposite." Nobody spoke after that. Rain continued falling outside while the silence settled over the table like dust. And somewhere deep inside me, a terrible thought finally began to form. Maybe my family hadn't simply grown distant over the years. Maybe they had been hiding something from me all along. And judging by the look on Melissa's face tonight, whatever it was had started long before I ever realized. I left Ryan's house earlier than usual that night. Melissa hugged me at the front door with the same careful politeness she always used after uncomfortable conversations. Her perfume smelled expensive and sharp, something floral layered over something colder underneath. "Drive safe, Eleanor," she said softly, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "And do not overthink what Sophie said. Children notice strange things sometimes." I smiled back because that was what I had trained myself to do over the years. Smile. Keep the peace. Pretend not to notice when conversations stopped as soon as I entered a room. Pretend not to notice how Melissa always answered questions directed at Ryan before he could speak for himself. Pretend not to notice how family memories seemed to begin only after she became part of our lives. Rain followed me the entire drive home, thin silver streaks sliding across the windshield beneath the glow of streetlights. Connecticut always looked lonely in the rain, especially the older neighborhoods where every porch light seemed to belong to someone waiting for a phone call that never came. My house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac lined with maple trees already beginning to lose their leaves even though summer had not fully ended yet. The porch light flickered when I unlocked the front door. I made a mental note to replace the bulb tomorrow. Then I stepped inside and froze for a moment in the silence. 20 years ago, this house sounded different. Ryan used to run through the hallways with muddy sneakers after Little League practice, while his father yelled half-heartedly about the carpet. Music used to drift from the kitchen radio on Saturday mornings while I cooked pancakes and bacon. Now the loudest sound most nights was the hum of the refrigerator. I slipped off my shoes and walked slowly into the kitchen. The digital clock above the microwave blinked 10:43 p.m. in soft green numbers. I poured myself a cup of chamomile tea and stood by the sink watching rainwater collect along the edge of the backyard patio. Melissa's face kept replaying in my mind. Not the smile she wore afterward, the look before it, that brief flash of fear when Sophie asked about the missing photographs. Fear does not appear without a reason. I carried my tea upstairs to the hallway closet where old storage boxes sat stacked behind winter coats and in used Christmas decorations. I had not opened some of them in years. Dust coated the lids. My fingers trembled slightly as I pulled down the first photo album. Blue leather cover. Gold lettering faded with age. Family memories. I sat cross-legged on the bedroom floor and opened it slowly. Thanksgiving dinners. Ryan's 8th birthday party. Christmas mornings beside the fireplace. Then suddenly the photographs stopped. The next page jumped forward nearly 6 years. Ryan standing beside Melissa at their engagement dinner in Chicago. I frowned and flipped backward, then forward again. Entire sections of our lives were missing. No middle school graduation pictures. No summer at Lake Champlain. No photographs from our trip to Maine after Ryan's father recovered from surgery. Nothing. My chest tightened. I opened another album. Same thing. Large, empty gaps hidden so neatly I had somehow never questioned them before. I stared down at the blank plastic sleeves where photographs should have been and felt something strange move through me. Not grief, not anger, recognition, like finally seeing the shape of something that had been standing in the dark for years. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 15 years ago, I had asked Melissa whether she had seen the box of older family photographs after our basement flooded. I remembered exactly how quickly she answered. Most of them were ruined, she had said while barely glancing up from her phone. At the time, I believed her immediately. Why would I not? She was family. I closed the album carefully and looked around the bedroom. My late husband's reading chair still sat near the window, untouched except for the thin layer of dust gathering on the wooden arms. Sometimes I still caught myself expecting him to walk back into the room, carrying the morning newspaper. He always noticed things before I did. Small things, quiet things, the kind of details other people overlooked. A sudden chill moved through the house, although the heat was still running. I stood slowly and carried the albums back toward the closet. That was when I noticed it. One storage box pushed farther into the corner behind the others. Smaller, gray, locked. I stared at the small gray lockbox for nearly a full minute before touching it. Dust covered the metal surface except for one faint streak near the handle, as though someone had moved it more recently than the others. My heartbeat slowed into that strange calm that sometimes arrives right before terrible news. Outside, rain continued tapping softly against the bedroom windows while the grandfather clock downstairs marked midnight with a low hollow chime. I carried the box carefully into the kitchen and placed it beneath the overhead light. The lock itself was old-fashioned, scratched near the keyhole. For a moment, I almost put it back. Some part of me already understood that whatever sat inside that box had been hidden for a reason. But another part of me, the part that had spent years swallowing discomfort to preserve peace, had finally grown tired of silence. I opened the junk drawer beside the refrigerator and searched through old batteries, rubber bands, expired coupons, and loose keys collected over decades. By the third handful, My fingers froze around a small brass key attached to a faded blue tag. In my husband's handwriting, barely visible now, were 2 words: just in case. My throat tightened immediately. Daniel Hayes always labeled important things carefully. Bank files, emergency cash, insurance folders. He believed preparation was a form of love. I returned to the kitchen table and slid the key slowly into the lock. It clicked open without resistance. Inside sat several envelopes tied neatly with a thin brown ribbon, a flash drive, and a photograph resting face down beneath them. My hands trembled as I lifted the picture first. It was Ryan at 12 years old standing beside his father near the lake cabin in Vermont, both of them smiling into bright summer sunlight. I had not seen that photograph in at least 15 years. On the back, my husband had written a date and one sentence beneath it: never let anyone erase where we came from. I lowered myself slowly into the kitchen chair. The room suddenly felt too quiet. I untied the ribbon around the envelopes and recognized my husband's handwriting immediately. Some were addressed to me. Others carried dates stretching back nearly 2 decades. Before I could open the first letter, the phone rang. The sound startled me so badly I nearly dropped the stack onto the floor. Nobody called after midnight anymore, especially not on a Sunday. I stared at the glowing screen for a moment before answering. "Hello." Silence lingered for 2 seconds. Then an older woman's voice spoke carefully. "Eleanor." I did not recognize the voice at first. "Yes." Another pause. "This is Judith Palmer." The name hit me like cold water. Judith had worked with my husband years ago before she suddenly disappeared from our lives. I remembered Ryan once mentioning that Melissa did not like her. At the time, I never asked why. "I know it is late," Judith continued softly, "but after tonight, I think you finally found the box." My grip tightened around the phone. "How do you know about this?" "Because your husband told me where he hid it." My eyes drifted slowly toward the open lockbox on the kitchen table. Rainwater slid down the dark windows behind me in long, crooked lines. "Eleanor," Judith said quietly, "I need you to listen carefully before you open those letters." Something in her voice made my stomach turn. Not drama, not excitement. Exhaustion. The kind carried by people who have spent years holding on to a truth nobody wanted to hear. Your husband knew someone inside your family was removing pieces of your life little by little. He noticed it long before you did. I closed my eyes. Suddenly dozens of small memories returned all at once. Missing albums. Stories interrupted whenever I mentioned the past. Melissa reorganizing old closets without asking. Ryan becoming colder every year after his marriage. Tiny moments that seemed meaningless on their own now pressed together into something heavier. "What are you trying to tell me?" I whispered. Judith inhaled slowly on the other end of the line. "I am trying to tell you that the life you think you remember was edited for you, Eleanor. And the person controlling the story was never your son." After Judith hung up, I remained at the kitchen table for a very long time without moving. The rain had finally stopped outside, but water still dripped slowly from the gutters beyond the window. The clock above the stove read 12:41 a.m. The house felt different now. Not unfamiliar exactly. More like a place I had lived in for years without noticing certain doors were locked. I picked up the top envelope from the stack with careful hands. My name was written across the front in my husband's handwriting. Eleanor. Just that. No date. No explanation. I opened it slowly, afraid of what waited inside. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Daniel always kept important letters inside his desk drawer beside packets of cedar chips because he hated the smell of dust. My eyes moved across the page while the kitchen light hummed softly overhead. If you are reading this, it means you finally started asking questions. I warned them not to underestimate your memory. My throat tightened immediately. I continued reading. Melissa is smarter than people realize. She does not create conflict directly. She redirects it. Quietly. Patiently. By the time people notice the damage, they no longer remember where it started. I lowered the letter for a moment and stared toward the dark hallway leading into the living room. Suddenly memories began surfacing one after another with terrifying clarity. Melissa offering to organize family photographs after our basement flood. Melissa volunteering to handle holiday invitations because she said I seemed overwhelmed. Melissa gently correcting Ryan whenever he remembered stories differently from her version. That is not exactly how it happened, sweetheart. She always said it smiling. Soft voice. Calm expression. never confrontational. Back then I interpreted her behavior as helpful, thoughtful even. Now I understood something chilling. Melissa had never forced herself into the center of our family. She had slowly moved me out of it instead. I looked back down at the letter. Daniel's handwriting became shakier toward the bottom of the page. Ryan trusts her completely now. I tried talking to him twice. Both times he defended her before I could finish explaining. I am writing this because someday you may begin noticing what I noticed too late. People do not lose entire histories by accident. My eyes filled with tears then, although I never actually cried. The sadness sat deeper than tears. Daniel had known. Maybe not everything, but enough to leave warnings behind. Enough to hide evidence where Melissa would never find it. I folded the letter carefully and reached for another envelope. But before opening it, another memory surfaced unexpectedly. 15 years ago, Ryan and I had argued after Thanksgiving dinner. One of the few serious arguments we ever had. I had mentioned wanting to visit the old lake cabin in Vermont because I missed family trips there. Ryan became strangely irritated almost immediately. "You always live in the past," he snapped at me. Melissa stood quietly beside him, rubbing his shoulder while he spoke. "Maybe it is healthier to move on from things that no longer matter." At the time, I blamed grief, stress, marriage problems. But now I remembered something else. Ryan did not sound like himself during that conversation. He sounded rehearsed, as though someone else had already explained my personality to him in private before he ever walked into that room. I slowly stood from the kitchen table and carried the letters into the living room. Daniel's old reading chair still faced the fireplace exactly where he left it before cancer hollowed him down to shadows and quiet smiles. During the last year of his life, Melissa visited constantly, bringing soup, helping with errands, offering support. Everyone praised her devotion, even me, especially me. I sat beside the chair and closed my eyes briefly. Then another detail returned so suddenly it made my stomach twist. 3 weeks before Daniel died, he asked me whether I still kept copies of our old financial records and family photographs in the upstairs office cabinet. I told him Melissa had already organized everything after the move. I remembered the expression on his face afterward. Not anger, not panic, just disappointment, quiet disappointment. At the time I thought he was exhausted from treatment. Now I understood the truth. He had already realized parts of our lives were disappearing, and he knew exactly who was responsible. The sky outside had already begun turning pale gray by the time I opened the second envelope. Morning crept slowly through the living room windows, washing the furniture in cold, early light that made everything appear older than it really was. I had not slept at all. The untouched cup of tea beside me had gone completely cold hours earlier. Somewhere down the street, a garbage truck groaned to a stop while birds began chirping softly in the wet trees outside. Ordinary sounds, normal sounds, but nothing inside me felt normal anymore. I unfolded the second letter carefully. Unlike the first one, this page carried a date at the top. October 14th, 2011. Nearly 15 years ago. Eleanor, if Melissa ever convinces Ryan to separate you from family finances completely, I need you to contact Judith immediately. Do not argue with Ryan directly. It will only push him further toward her version of events. My breathing slowed. Her version of events. Even Daniel described it that way. As though Melissa had spent years constructing an entirely separate reality around our family, one careful piece at a time. I kept reading. She studies people quietly. She learns their weaknesses first. Then she builds herself into whatever role gives her the most control. I noticed it after my surgery, when she began managing conversations before they even happened. Ryan stopped speaking for himself. He repeated her conclusions almost word for word. I lowered the paper slowly into my lap. Another memory surfaced immediately. Ryan visiting me shortly after Daniel's second round of treatments. I had suggested postponing the sale of our Boston property because Daniel still felt emotionally attached to it. Ryan became frustrated unusually fast. "Dad needs less stress, Mom," he said sharply. "Melissa already explained why holding onto the property is unhealthy for both of you." At the time, I barely noticed the phrasing. Melissa already explained, as though she had become translator, interpreter, and authority inside every family discussion without anyone formally giving her that role. Back then I told myself modern marriages worked differently than older ones, that younger couples naturally operated as a unit. Now I realize something much darker. Ryan no longer trusted his own memories whenever Melissa offered him a different version. I stood slowly and walked toward the hallway cabinet where old financial binders sat untouched beside insurance paperwork. My fingers drifted across the labels Daniel had handwritten years ago. Taxes, retirement, property records, family trust. The last binder stopped me cold. Family trust. I stared at it for several seconds before pulling it free. The binder felt thinner than I remembered. Too thin. I carried it back to the kitchen table and opened it carefully beneath the morning light. Several sections were missing entirely. Empty dividers sat between partial records like pulled teeth. No copies of the Vermont property agreement. No documentation for Daniel's secondary investment account. No original trust amendments. Just gaps. Clean gaps. Deliberate gaps. A terrible stillness settled over me then. Because people do not accidentally remove only the documents connected to long-term assets and inheritance decisions. My eyes drifted toward the lockbox still sitting open on the table. Beside the envelopes rested the flash drive Daniel had hidden all those years ago. I picked it up slowly between my fingers. Small, black, ordinary looking, yet suddenly it felt heavier than anything else in the room. Before I could stop myself, I walked upstairs to the office and turned on my old desktop computer. The machine hummed awake slowly while morning rain clouds shifted outside the window. My reflection stared back at me faintly on the dark screen. Tired eyes, silver hair falling loose around my shoulders. A woman who had spent years believing distance inside her family happened naturally with time. The computer finally loaded. I inserted the flash drive carefully and opened the folder inside. Only 3 files appeared on the screen. 1 video recording, 1 scanned document folder, 1 audio file, labeled simply, "If you are ready for the truth." My hand froze over the mouse. Then my cell phone buzzed sharply against the desk. Melissa. I stared at her name glowing across the screen while my heartbeat quickened. The message preview appeared beneath it. "Good morning, Eleanor. Ryan thinks you seemed upset after dinner last night. Maybe we should talk before misunderstandings grow into unnecessary tension." I stared at Melissa's message without replying. The words looked harmless enough on the screen. Warm even. But after everything I had uncovered during the past few hours, I could suddenly hear the machinery underneath her sentences. "Maybe we should talk before misunderstandings grow into unnecessary tension." Melissa never approached conflict directly. She managed perception first, controlled emotional temperature before facts could fully surface. Daniel had seen it years ago. Somehow I had missed it completely. I placed the phone face down on the desk and looked back toward the computer screen. The audio file still waited there silently. "If you are ready for the truth." My finger hovered over the mouse for several seconds before finally clicking. Static crackled softly through the computer speakers. Then Daniel's voice filled the room. Weak, tired, but unmistakably his. "Eleanor," he began quietly, "if you are hearing this, then I was right to worry." My chest tightened so suddenly I had to grip the edge of the desk. I had not heard his voice in nearly 4 years. "There are things I should have told you sooner," he continued after a long breath. I kept hoping I was imagining them, hoping stress and illness were affecting my judgment. But eventually the pattern became impossible to ignore. Outside the office window, morning sunlight finally pushed through the clouds, illuminating dust drifting slowly through the room. Everything looked painfully ordinary while my entire understanding of my family shifted underneath me. "Melissa isolates people gradually," Daniel said. "Not by force, by replacement. She becomes the source of information, emotional support, decision-making. Then eventually she controls how people interpret everyone else." I closed my eyes. Briefly, replacement. That was exactly what happened. Ryan stopped calling me directly years ago. Conversations always passed through Melissa first. Family plans changed without anyone informing me until the last minute. Even small disagreements somehow transformed into evidence that I was difficult or emotional or living too much in the past. Daniel coughed weakly on the recording before continuing. I tried confronting Ryan twice. Both times Melissa convinced him I was overreacting because of treatment medication. The sadness in his voice hollowed me out. My husband died believing his own son no longer trusted him. "There is one thing you need to understand," Daniel said carefully. "Ryan is not cruel. He is dependent." Melissa learned how to make him doubt himself years ago. Once that happened, she became the version of reality he trusted most. Tears finally slid down my face then, slow and silent. Not because Ryan had failed me, but because suddenly I understood how completely he had been manipulated too. I remembered the confident boy who once built tree houses with his father and argued passionately about everything from baseball teams to politics. Somewhere along the line, that certainty disappeared. Melissa filled the empty space slowly until Ryan no longer distinguished between his thoughts and hers. The recording continued. I moved certain assets before my final hospitalization because I was afraid Melissa would eventually separate you from financial control completely. My eyes opened immediately. The scanned files explain everything. Judith knows where the originals are stored. I clicked open the document folder with trembling hands. Property agreements, banking records, trust amendments, transfer authorizations. Some carried Daniel's signature beside dates from the last year of his life. Others showed revisions I had never seen before. My stomach twisted as I realized how many legal decisions happened without my full understanding during Daniel's illness. Then I saw Melissa's name appearing repeatedly beside financial restructuring notes connected to Ryan's accounts. Not ownership exactly. Influence, access, oversight, quiet involvement woven through everything. My cell phone buzzed again against the desk. Another message from Melissa. Ryan wants to stop by later today. He feels terrible if something upset you. The phrasing chilled me immediately. If something upset you, not if we upset you. As though emotions simply appeared inside me randomly without cause. Daniel's voice suddenly returned through the speakers. Eleanor, if you discover the truth, promise me one thing. Do not confront Melissa emotionally. She survives emotional chaos because it lets her redirect blame. Stay calm. Stay patient. Facts matter more than anger. I leaned back slowly in the chair while sunlight spread across the office floorboards. For the first time in years, I understood why I always felt exhausted after family gatherings. I had spent 2 decades defending myself against accusations subtle enough to remain invisible. Tiny suggestions, tiny corrections, tiny rewrites of memory repeated so consistently they became reality. And the most painful part was this. Melissa had never needed to destroy my family outright. She only needed to convince everyone that my version of our family could no longer be trusted. Ryan arrived just after 3 that afternoon, carrying a paper bag from the bakery near my neighborhood. Blueberry muffins. My favorite. He used to bring them home every Saturday morning when he was in college because he knew I loved the crumb topping. The memory hurt more now than if he had arrived empty-handed. I watched through the living room window as he stepped out of his SUV and adjusted the cuffs of his coat before walking toward the porch. Melissa was not with him. That alone told me she understood something had shifted. Ryan knocked softly, even though he still had his own key. Another small change I had never questioned before. Family members do not usually stop using their keys unless someone slowly teaches them they no longer fully belong. I opened the door and forced a calm smile. Hi, sweetheart. Ryan leaned down to kiss my cheek quickly. He smelled like rain and expensive cologne. Tiny gray streaks had started appearing near his temples during the last couple years. Suddenly, I could see Daniel in his face. Again for the first time in ages. Melissa thought you might like these, he said, holding up the bakery bag awkwardly. Of course she did. Even kindness arrived through her voice now. That was thoughtful, I replied quietly. I led him into the kitchen where afternoon sunlight stretched across the counters in pale golden lines. Ryan glanced around the room carefully while I prepared coffee. Nervous energy followed him everywhere today. Mom, he finally said. Melissa said dinner became uncomfortable last night. I kept my eyes on the coffee cups. Did it? You know how she worries about tension in the family. The sentence landed exactly the way Daniel described in his recording. Melissa always positioned herself as protector of emotional stability while quietly controlling the emotional narrative itself. I carried the coffee mugs to the table and sat down across from my son. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt unfamiliar between us now. Not hostile, just distant. Like 2 people trying to remember the shape of an older relationship buried beneath years of careful politeness. Ryan, I said softly, do you remember our lake cabin in Vermont? His expression shifted immediately. Tiny hesitation, tiny confusion. Sort of, he answered slowly. Not clearly. You used to fish with your father every summer there. He frowned faintly. Melissa said Dad mostly worked during those years. My chest tightened, not because of the statement itself, Because Ryan said it automatically, without reflection, like a memorized correction. That is strange, I replied gently. Because your father took months off every summer after selling the Boston office. Ryan looked uncomfortable suddenly. His fingers tapped lightly against the coffee mug. Maybe you are remembering different years. Different years. Another soft rewrite. Another explanation designed to blur certainty instead of confront facts directly. I studied my son quietly while afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor. Then I noticed something I had overlooked for years. Exhaustion. Ryan looked perpetually tired around family conversations. Not angry, not defensive, drained, as though constantly balancing invisible emotional weight. Can I ask you something honestly? I said. Of course. When was the last time you trusted your own memory before checking whether Melissa remembered it differently? Ryan blinked at me. Genuine confusion crossed his face first, then discomfort. Mom, what does that mean? I leaned back slowly in my chair. Nothing, I said softly. I just missed the version of you who used to argue with everyone. He laughed awkwardly. Melissa says I have matured. There it was again. Melissa says. Melissa thinks. Melissa explained. My son spoke about his own life the way employees quote management during meetings. Carefully, automatically. We sat quietly for another minute before Ryan finally sighed. Look, Mom, Melissa feels like you have been distant lately. I almost smiled at the irony. Has she? She worries you resent her. The sentence floated between us while the refrigerator hummed softly nearby. 20 years. 20 years of subtle redirection until even my distance from the family became evidence against me instead of consequence of what had been done to me. I folded my hands together calmly. Ryan, I asked gently, has Melissa ever told you why Judith Palmer disappeared from our lives? His entire body stiffened almost instantly. Not dramatically, just enough. Judith? He repeated carefully. Why are you bringing her up? I held his gaze without blinking. Because she called me last night. Color drained slowly from his face. For the first time since walking into my house, my son looked genuinely afraid. Ryan stared at me across the kitchen table like I had spoken a name from another lifetime. For several seconds he said nothing at all. The afternoon sunlight had faded behind thick clouds again, turning the kitchen dim and colorless. Judith called you? He repeated quietly. I nodded once. Last night. His jaw tightened immediately. What did she say? There was no anger in his voice. Only anxiety. Deep, familiar anxiety. The kind people carry when they already know certain truths exist, but spend years avoiding them. I studied him carefully before answering. She said Dad knew things were disappearing from this family long before he died. Ryan looked away first. His gaze drifted toward the window above the sink where rain had started again in soft, uneven drops. Mom, he began weakly, then stopped. I waited. He rubbed both hands together slowly the way Daniel used to whenever difficult conversations approached. Another tiny resemblance I had forgotten. Melissa said Judith was manipulative, he finally said. She told me Dad stopped trusting her near the end. Near the end. I almost asked whether Ryan remembered that himself or simply inherited the memory from Melissa, but I already knew the answer. Instead, I stood quietly and walked upstairs to the office. Ryan followed several steps behind me without speaking. The old desktop computer still glowed softly in the corner beside Daniel's bookshelves. I sat down at the desk and opened the scan document folder while Ryan remained standing near the doorway. Mom, what is all this? He asked carefully. Something your father wanted me to find. I clicked through bank records, trust amendments, and property transfers while silence thickened inside the room. Then I opened one particular document. Daniel's handwritten notes attached beside revised financial records from 3 years before his death. Ryan stepped closer slowly. I watched his expression change as he read the first paragraph. Melissa requested oversight access again today. I refused. Eleanor does not yet realize how much control Melissa already has over family communication. Ryan blinked hard. What is this? He whispered. Your father's notes. No, he shook his head immediately. Dad would have talked to me directly. According to him, he tried. Ryan looked stunned. Truly stunned. Like someone slowly recognizing their own house after years of living in darkness. I clicked open the audio recording again. Daniel's tired voice filled the office quietly. Ryan is not the problem. Dependency is the problem. Once someone stops trusting their own judgment, they become vulnerable to whoever provides certainty. My son lowered himself slowly into the chair across from me. The color had nearly disappeared from his face now. Daniel's voice continued. Melissa reframes conflict so consistently that eventually nobody remembers where disagreements began. Even Eleanor has started apologizing for things she never actually did wrong. Ryan covered his mouth with one hand. A long silence followed after the recording stopped. Rain tapped softly against the office windows while the old heater clicked somewhere downstairs. Finally, Ryan spoke. I remember, his voice cracked slightly. I remember Dad trying to tell me something during chemo treatments. He stared blankly toward the bookshelf. Melissa said he was confused from medication. My chest tightened painfully. Ryan looked up at me slowly. Mom, I think there were times she told me you blamed me for things. Did I? He swallowed hard. I do not know anymore. That answer hurt worse than anything else. Not because he doubted me, because I could finally see how completely his confidence had eroded over the years. Melissa never needed Ryan to hate me. She only needed him uncertain enough to rely on her interpretation instead of his own experiences. Ryan stood abruptly and walked toward the window. There were moments, he said quietly. Small moments. I thought something felt wrong. He laughed bitterly under his breath. Every time I questioned it, Melissa somehow convinced me I was remembering things incorrectly. I closed the document folder slowly. Your father noticed the same thing. Ryan pressed his hand against the glass while rainwater streaked down outside. Why would she do this? He whispered. I thought about that carefully before answering. Some people do not feel secure unless they control how everyone around them sees reality. He turned toward me, then with tears finally gathering in his eyes. Not dramatic tears, exhausted ones. Mom, he asked softly, how long have I been losing pieces of this family without even realizing it? 3 weeks later, I sat alone on the porch of a small rental cottage overlooking the shoreline in Cape Cod, while cold ocean wind moved through the tall beach grass beside the deck. The house was modest. White shutters, blue front door, a chipped wooden bench near the steps that looked older than I was. Nothing fancy, nothing designed to impress anyone. But for the first time in years, the silence around me felt peaceful instead of lonely. A ceramic mug of coffee rested between my hands while gulls circled somewhere above the water. Inside the cottage, unopened moving boxes still lined the hallway because I had not decided where anything belonged yet. Strangely, that uncertainty no longer frightened me. Back at the Connecticut house, I spent 20 years trying to preserve a version of family that had quietly disappeared piece by piece while I apologized for noticing the emptiness. Now every room around me held possibility instead of confusion. Ryan called almost every evening now. Sometimes we spoke for an hour, sometimes only 10 minutes. Rebuilding trust felt awkward at first, like learning how to walk across ice that once cracked beneath you. But little by little, I started hearing my son's real voice again. Not Melissa's interpretations, not carefully managed conversations. Just Ryan. Honest. Exhausted. Grieving. 2 weeks earlier, he admitted something that still stayed with me. Mom, he said quietly over the phone. I think I stopped trusting myself years ago. I had closed my eyes after hearing that because it explained everything. Manipulation rarely begins with cruelty. It begins with erosion. Small corrections repeated over time until confidence dissolves completely. Ryan was finally beginning to understand that. So was I. Melissa moved into an apartment outside Hartford shortly after Ryan confronted her with Daniel's recordings and financial documents. According to Ryan, she never screamed, never cried dramatically. She simply insisted everyone misunderstood her intentions. I only tried to protect this family from conflict, she told him calmly. Even then, she framed herself as guardian of stability rather than source of harm. That was what made people like Melissa so difficult to recognize. They rarely looked dangerous. They looked organized, helpful, rational. By the time others noticed the emotional damage, they no longer trusted their own instincts enough to question it properly. I never confronted her directly after that afternoon in my office. Daniel had been right. Emotional battles only created confusion. Facts mattered more. Quiet distance mattered more. I updated my financial accounts, restored legal documents Daniel protected for me, and transferred the Connecticut house into a trust Melissa could never access through Ryan again. Not because I wanted revenge, because I finally understood the difference between forgiveness and permission. One heals you, the other keeps hurting you. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I turned toward the porch steps, and saw Sophie standing there bundled inside a pale yellow sweatshirt with windblown hair falling across her face. Ryan stood several feet behind her near the driveway, holding 2 grocery bags. For a moment, my chest tightened unexpectedly. Not from pain this time, from relief. Sophie smiled first. "Grandma," she said brightly, "Dad said you might let me help decorate the cottage today." I laughed softly and set down my coffee mug. "Only if you promise not to judge my terrible taste in curtains." Ryan smiled then. A real smile. Smaller than the ones he used to wear years ago, but genuine. He walked toward the porch slowly while ocean wind rattled the wooden railing beside us. "I brought blueberry muffins," he said quietly. The same bakery bag rested in his hands. This time he had chosen it himself. I could tell immediately. There was something strange about healing after betrayal. People imagine it arrives dramatically. One conversation, one apology, one moment where everything finally makes sense again. But real healing happened differently. Quietly. In ordinary moments. A son carrying breakfast without someone telling him what to buy. A granddaughter asking innocent questions nobody rushed to silence. A woman sitting beside the ocean realizing peace feels unfamiliar at first when chaos controlled your life for too long. I looked out toward the gray Atlantic waves rolling steadily beneath the cloudy afternoon sky and thought about the missing photographs that started all of this. 20 years erased so carefully I almost doubted my own memories. But the truth about family is this. Love does not require you to forget yourself in order to keep other people comfortable. And sometimes the most powerful thing an older woman can do is finally trust the version of events she lived through all along.